The Neoliberal Podcast is part of the Neoliberal Project and made possible by our members and supporters. If you enjoy the podcast and want to become a member of the project, head to neoliberalproject.org/join. You can also support us on Patreon at patreon.com/neoliberalproject. These members and patrons help cover the podcast's expenses and make it all happen. Thanks for your support and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Progressive Policy Institute. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and today we're talking about economic growth and the grand narratives that we talk about when we talk about what's happened to our economy over the last several hundred years. One of the main grand narratives of the 20th century is often the narrative of the short 20th century. That is the 20th century that lasts between World War I and the end of the Cold War, roughly 1914 to about 1991. And this is kind of a political and military narrative of how the 20th century worked. But today's guest is Brad DeLong. He's the author of the new book, Slouching Towards Utopia. He's the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. He's a professor at Cal Berkeley. He's far too online since 1995, and he's written this book to argue for a new narrative about the 20th century, what he calls the long 20th century. Rather than judging from World War I to the end of the Cold War, he argues that the real narrative thread of the 20th century is one of economic growth, and that we should look at it in terms of a long 20th century from about 1870 to 2010, and how economic growth and prosperity defined that time. And so that's what we're talking about today. Professor Brad DeLong, welcome to the show.
Welcome. I'm happy to be here in this virtual metaverse space with you.
Everything's the metaverse now, right?
Everything's the metaverse.
All right, so I think I want to start by just talking about this idea of grand narratives, because you wrote a book built around this grand narrative very explicitly of the long 20th century. And it brought to my mind kind of this quote that I've heard before, and I've heard this from economists and from historians and different academics, that basically all grand narratives are false, but some of them are useful. So how do you think about that kind of quote in the context of what you're trying to do?
Well, it is certainly true. But if you let me back up for a second, this is not... I did not write a tweet. I did not write a blog post. I did not write an op-ed. I did not write an article. I wrote a book. And if you're going to write a book, the book has to do, I think, three things. First, every single page has to be interesting, or else people stop reading in the middle of the page. Second, every single book has to have enough of a sense of narrative flow that people, when they reach the end of the page, are asking what happens next. And so turn it and start reading the next page. And third, with a nonfiction book, people have to take what they're reading and somehow slot it into some architectural web of knowledge. So they think there is actually a point, that they're learning something, that this has a place. And for that, you really need a grand narrative, a simple through story, something that structures that, narrative web of information and that people can grasp. The problem, though, is that all simple grand narratives are false. But I needed one, and in the end, I decided that the one that I could actually execute was a Karl Polanyi-esque grand narrative, a political economy one. And that actually shaped the book. That's why you now have these 600 pages in Slouching Towards Utopia available from Basic on September 6th, rather than some other subset from the 2,000 pieces of notes and scratchings and drafts that are on the cutting room floor.
I really appreciate books like this about economic growth, because I think there's a quote from Robert Lucas that applies to me. Robert Lucas, who's a Nobel Prize winner, said at one point, once you start thinking about growth, and he meant economic growth, it's hard to think about anything else. And I think that quote could really apply to your book really well because, you can think about history through all these frames, through a military frame of the Great Wars, through the ideological frame of, fascism and liberal democracy and totalitarian communism all fighting each other in the 20th century. That's certainly a valid frame. But once you start thinking about the economic lens and you think about how poor the world was in 1870 or 1880 and how rich we are today, it's really hard to view the world as anything other than that, at least for me. Do you find that same issue? Like, have you been captured by the growth bug, so to speak?
Yeah, very much so. And the way I'd put it is that, after 1870, for the first time in human history, there was the potential for technology advancing fast enough that humanity might be able to bake a sufficiently large economic pie, for everyone to have enough. And for having enough to not depend on your being in an elite that was successfully running a force and fraud, domination and exploitation game against the rest of society, and also managing to block its own status and power against other potential competing elites. And that thing that happened around 1870 was a total sea change, and it means that history afterwards, is a completely different animal in its essentials from history before. I mean, if you want to put it in a nutshell, you can say that there has been, in terms of its ability to boost human productivity and livelihoods, there's been as much technological growth and progress since 1870 as there was since minus 6,000 in 1870.
So why specifically 1870? Why start the book then? Is there a specific set of jumping off points that you think were really a specific turning point that makes it the logical place to start?
Before 1770, since the invention of agriculture, and say in minus 6,000 up to 1770, technology always lost the race against fertility. And we had a extremely poor, because resource constrained, given the level of technology and population, a very poor world, with most of humanity having a living standard that the World Bank would say is on the edge of extreme poverty, if they were back there. From 1770 to 1870, technological advance more or less kept pace with fertility. But it was not clear that was going to last, right? That depended on there still being lots of really cheap coal at the surface. That depended on you're getting a huge productivity boost from doing things like gathering all the manufacturing of the world into the place where it was more productive, and you could only do that kind of thing once. After 1870, though, you have the more than quadrupling of the rate of global technological progress. And all of a sudden, we're on the road to a world where we can bake a big enough economic pie.
And this question of, the population versus growth, this is kind of what led to Malthus in the 1800s, right? Where it was very much an open question. And actually, for the time, it wasn't unreasonable to think that if the population grows, they're all just going to be starving because we don't have any ability to feed them.
I think it was by and large a closed question, right? That in the last edition of his Principles of Political Economy in 1873, John Stuart Mill takes a very hard line, saying that all the inventions of the Industrial Revolution have not raised the standard of living of the bulk of the population, of the working class. They are still trapped in the same life of drudgery and imprisonment. And John Stuart Mill says we won't get out of this until the world government is willing to clamp down and require that people buy child licenses in order to constrain the growth of population. And only then will we have an opportunity to actually create a rich and human world, because otherwise, Malthus is just going to win.
Yeah, it's the irony of Thomas Malthus that he was right about every time period previous to when he wrote that, and then immediately wrong about the about the rest of the
Not
future.
immediately, right? John Stuart Mill is writing almost a century later, and John Stuart Mill is known to us as, the boss libertarian, the apostle of, human liberty, and its widest distribution. And yet John Stuart Mill says humanity's best road in the future is to have a world in which jackbooted thugs break into your house and forcibly sterilize you if you have not paid the money to buy your child license and tried to have a child outside the legal order. And that's a hell of a place for someone of libertarian instincts to go. And yet that's what John Stuart Mill thought was necessary for a good world as late as 1870.
So one of the central questions of economics that I've always been fascinated by, that a lot of these growth narratives kind of touch on, is two related questions. I view them as like the queen of economic questions, so to speak. And they are, why are some countries rich and some countries poor? And to me, it's basically the same question as why did the Industrial Revolution take place? Because why are some countries rich and poor? Well, some countries had the Industrial Revolution, and some didn't. But then why did that take place is its own complicated question. And there's a lot of schools of thought on this. You can talk about the kind of Mokier school of thought about, the invention of invention and intellectual exchange in the Republic of Letters. You can talk about imperialism as a potential explanation, that because the European colonizers had all these colonies that allowed them to, industrialize. Do you have a kind of a grand narrative of why this happened, or do you kind of take from the different strands of thought?
Well, I would say that ketchup has some similarities, but a lot of differences with forging the future. And that, but they're not, they should, I think, generally be treated, separately. And as for ketchup, we are not doing well. The world is not as unequal in economic terms as it has ever been, but it is close. And it is a striking scandal that we have managed to spread effective medical and public health technology around the world. So now in every country, expected lifespan at birth is between 60 and 80, but income levels are still all over the place. It is a complete atrocity that there are still 500 million of us whose lives are, nutritionally at least, and in terms of possession of material goods other than cell phones, not that different from that of our pre-industrial ancestors. But most of the world is far richer than even the richest parts of the world were in 1900. That because progress has been so fast and so huge, makes the gaps loom very large. But if one turns things around and says, well, in a 9 millennium history of civilization, this country was a century later in coming to modern economic growth. You might say that catch-up is something that is happening, although not nearly as fast as we would like. Forging the future is how we manage to forge the future is a more difficult problem.
So you're somewhat more focused on why this hasn't happened yet in great portions of the globe, rather than the story of how it happened originally, so to speak.
You start with it happening, right? And you can say that you need a lot of things to all come together. And if you're missing one or two of them, then, it doesn't happen. Right? Like, the invention of coinage. You invent coinage in minus, 600 BC in Anatolia. And now that you have coinage, that before you have coinage, if you want to have a division of labor, either you have to go through the temples or the kings, who are mostly interested in taking their share, and for whom being intermediaries in a productive division of labor is largely a side gig. Or you can engage in a division of labor with your friends, your relatives, your neighbors, and not all of them. After coinage, right, you can, you can engage in win-win market exchange potentially with people anywhere in the world. And so, say, in the middle of, back when Herodotus was writing in Athens, the Athenians were building an 80-ton statue of Athena fighting in front, Athena Promachos, to put on top of the Acropolis. For this, they needed 70 tons of copper, which came from Cyprus, and 10 tons of tin, which they really didn't know where it came from. And yet the combination of coinage and local exchange and short-distance sea travel meant that a whole bunch of people in Cornwall dug up 10 tons of tin and then shipped it to Athens so it could become part of this statue, so you can make a statue of bronze that would actually last. And that's
this is almost the this is the Milton Friedman like eye pencil kind of essay, that you don't have to know what you're digging the thing up for it to be socially useful.
In fact, nobody does. Or you can say that maybe it's the rule of law and security of property, that you need an imperial peace. Or you can say that what you really need is, the investiture controversy, in which law becomes not just a tool of the powerful, but something that constrains the powerful, even the most powerful, even kings and emperors. Or you could say it's Gutenberg. Or you could say it's the Black Death that shifts you into late female marriage, which creates a middle class, because women come to marriage with dowries for 8 years of working as a milkmaid. And so you have a potential demand for manufactured goods to kind of get the market economy over the hump. Or you can say it's the Renaissance, or the Enlightenment, the founding of the Royal Society, and a tradition of disciplined inquiry that appeals to experiment, rather than to is this claim socially useful in helping the elite's force and fraud mechanism keep going. You can say you had to have coal on the surface, that it wouldn't have happened if the last glaciers hadn't scraped all the post-Permian rock off the British Isles. You can say you needed the coal, but you also needed the tradition of empirical inquiry and the tinkerers, and you also needed the profits of empire to push real wages in Britain way, way, way high, so that a steam engine actually had a chance of being more cost-effective than just digging it out and pumping out the water in buckets. All of these things, right? All of the things before steam power, all they do is they get you to the commercial imperial revolution age, in which it looks like technology is advancing at 15% per century worldwide. Add in steam and automatic textile machinery, and you get the 1770 Industrial Revolution century, in which technology is advancing at less than 0.5% per year. But, technology advances at less than 0.5% per year. If world population is growing at 1% per year, and we know that a pre-birth control, nutritionally unstressed human population grows at something more like, 2% per year. That's what we see in settler expansions. The Industrial Revolution era rate of growth is not enough to get you over the Malthusian hump. But come 1870, come the last three pieces of the institutional complex falling into place, the Industrial Research Lab to rationalize and routinize discovery and development, and the modern corporation to rationalize and routinize development and deployment, and the global market to give huge incentives to deploy and diffuse technology. Our rate of technological growth grows more than fourfold from even its Industrial Revolution century pace, so that now humanity's technological competence since 1870 has more than doubled in every single generation. And at that, Malthus just cannot compete. Human fertility can't be large enough for greater numbers to eat up all of that potential growth. And once you get a rich society, patriarchy starts to wither away, and the first place where patriarchy starts to wither away is that fertility begins falling. And people begin focusing on having enough children and then raising them well. Even before 1880, everywhere except in France, if a woman has 9 pregnancies or late pregnancies, she'll have maybe 7 live births and stillbirths, maybe 6 live births, maybe 3 children survive to 5, or maybe 4 if you're lucky, 2 to 3 reach adulthood, 2 actually potentially outlive you. That's an average of 1 son, and in a patriarchal world, the only durable source of female social power is to be the mother of living sons. And if the expected number of sons is just a little over 1, that means a third of women are going to reach old age, if they reach old age, without, surviving sons. And under that kind of, child mortality hell, social pressures to try to have more children because you don't have a surviving son yet, or because you need insurance, are going to be overwhelming. But those ebb away as soon as society becomes rich enough. Then infant mortality falls enough because children are no longer so malnourished, their immune systems are so compromised, that you can actually be confident that your children will survive. And, that coming of the demographic transition begins rapidly after the more than quadrupling of economic growth in 1870. And once that's the case, the game is totally different. You're no longer in a Malthusian world. You have the potential of baking a big enough economic pie for everyone to have enough.
One thing that you said in the book that I admit surprised me a little bit, and I'm going to basically paraphrase this, but you said that you're confident that if you reran history a bunch of times, in most instances, the Industrial Revolution does not happen. Can you talk about why you think that is?
Well, perhaps if I were rewriting that, I would say would not have happened yet. And that's because you really seem to need to have, everything. Every single thing that's been identified as a key piece, for modern economic growth, people have pointed in the past at some place that had that key piece, but did not have the Industrial Revolution. There's the Sung Dynasty China, Greeks in 150 experimenting with how steam can produce pressure. All kinds of things, long traditions of disciplined empirical inquiry, and sophisticated communities of thought, trying to get it right. And yet, it's only in Britain in the 1730s that you get all of the cultural and institutional supports, plus really cheap coal and really expensive labor. And even that is not quite enough. You then need whatever additional things are needed to make people actually figure out how to do industrial research labs and modern corporations. So you have things like the Venetian or the Barcelonan Arsenal, which will look a lot like corporations with their sophisticated divisions of labor, but they're dead ends. That when the military need for maximum effort in terms of producing numbers of galleys kind of ebbs away, those other institutions are not then built on top of them.
It's very interesting to me that you said that, because I really wanted to ask you about specifically the laboratory and the corporation. Because sometimes when you read these books, and I've read a lot of books on the Industrial Revolution and how it happened, and everybody's got a grand narrative of how it happened, why it happened, what were the causes, here's my theory. And, sometimes you'll see institutional explanations, right? Like I mentioned the Mokyr explanation. We actually had Mokyr on the podcast, and he was fantastic to talk to. But if you hear about invention, you'll normally hear people mention, the steam engine was the driving force, or the, electricity was the driving force, or something like that. But when you talk about, and I think you classify these as inventions, you classify the corporation and the scientific laboratory as the most important things. So can you explain your focus on those?
Well, if I were Nate Rosenberg, I would actually say it was the machine tool industry and comes a little bit earlier. And both the fact that you have a machine tool industry and you have a community of engineering practice around machine tools, right? That machine tools are things that embody the technologies of making better stuff.
And what do you mean by a community of engineering practice?
A whole bunch of engineers who talk to each other, whether or not their bosses and employers actually want them to. The knowledge is not a rival good. And you need to have it if you're going to make a lot of technological progress, right? There's a reason why people wanting to build textile factories in the 1830s headed for Manchester, or people wanting to build automobiles in 1910 headed for Detroit, or people wanting to write, social media grifting programs to scare people and glue their eyeballs to the screen so they could be sold fake diabetes cures and overpriced crypto assets head for south of Market Street in San Francisco today. That invention and discovery is very much a community effort. I think it's the only things I can think of that actually happened around 1870. And it's the turning upward of the global lines of growth around 1870 that makes me think that these are the last three pieces of the institutional kind of configuration we need to fall into place in order to get the modern economic growth that we've seen since.
It almost seems like the application of invention at scale, like, if we take that Mokier idea about like the invention of invention, but it's not enough to have single lone geniuses in kind of the Galileo sense, with just working in a house, coming up with brilliant ideas alone. You need people working together in a laboratory, or
if you have a genius, and he also has to be, a manager, an impresario, a fundraiser, a marketer, as well as an inventor. It's kind of takes a lifetime to kind of try to successfully commercialize one significant invention. And, there are lots of people who are good at a piece of it, but not good at the whole thing. And for this, the poster child is, of course, Nikola Tesla. That, Nikola Tesla knew how to make electrons get up and dance in a way that virtually no one else did, right? That none of the other pioneers of electricity, none of the theoretical physicists, James Clerk Maxwell himself, had absolutely no idea about the potentials of alternating current power. That Tesla was at least a decade ahead of the engineering consensus in what he knew. But Tesla is absolutely hopeless in terms of his social intelligence. Tesla needed an industrial research laboratory set up by George Westinghouse, who would then soothe all the feathers that Tesla ruffled in it, in order to actually produce something useful out of Tesla's insight. And you then needed the Westinghouse Corporation and its financing from J.P. Morgan and George Fisher Baker, to actually build out what had been developed and into scale and actually deploy it. And of course, once that was done, the fact that you had the global market economy made lots of other people say, aha, we should copy this. You want to say that electricity is something like 10% of the world economy as of 1900, and you want to say that Tesla advanced it by 10 years. That's a huge impact, on the sector. To get 10 years of economic growth for a tenth of the economy, that means that Tesla himself is responsible for a 2 percentage point increment to all of human wealth. But he could do so only because of the particular institutional setup that he was embedded in. Had he come along any earlier, he would have been able to accomplish nothing. And that's always struck me as a stunning story.
So the story of economic growth, as you've said, is that for a long time, humanity basically doesn't grow, or it grows just extraordinarily slowly. There's we had better technology in 1500 than we did in year zero, but only by a marginal amount.
But only about 5% a century. Thomas Jefferson's slaves in 1770 are not living much better than Marcus Tullius Cicero's slaves in minus 60. Because, Cicero's slaves are squatting on some of the most productive land for wheat and oil in the world. And Rome even then, and the Roman Empire even then, was not that dense. While Jefferson has had the land he can find is, hill country, Virginia tobacco land, for which previous tobacco has already leached a bunch of stuff out of it.
But then around 1870 and earlier in 1770, you see a little bit of uptick in growth, and you start to get a little bit optimistic.
Especially in the 300 miles around the English port of Dover, and then in its offshoot in New England. Yep.
So this is the frame that we've got, where we're in a world that's very low growth for a very long time, most of human history. And then around 1870, we have this really unusual and amazing explosion of economic growth. But that leads to a lot of questions about how we're going to structure society as the world changes really rapidly. And you draw kind of a comparison between two leading voices, and you almost set up many portions of the book as a conversation between two ideas that you use Hayek and Polanyi to represent. And these are two thinkers, two kind of leading philosophers or economists. Can you talk about the two men and why you think that they're kind of appropriate foils for each other, and how society grapples with the questions that are raised by these two men?
Well, as I say, Friedrich von Hayek, he was almost surely the best at the insight that if you want to figure out how to properly crowdsource solutions to pretty much any social question, if you want to figure out how we can turn human brain power in the total to solving it, what you really want is you want a properly structured market economy, right? Because something else will involve someone at the center trying to plan what humanity as a whole is going to do, and that's unlikely to work because the information about what should be done locally is out there at the periphery. It's not in the center in the planning office. And there's also the problem of incentivization, of getting people to properly report to do the proper things, even if they're commanded to do the right thing. How do you know they will? Solving the problems of incentivization and of information, pushing decision-making, and also responsibility and consequences out to the periphery of society where the information really is what the properly aligned market economy is absolutely best at. So you want to actually set humanity to figuring out how do we produce a more productive world? How do we use all this wonderful technology that our scientists, our industrial research labs are producing? You want to have a market economy. And indeed, when we do get the market economy, we do find our deployed and diffused stock value of the stock of technology is doubling every generation. But that doubling every generation, Schumpeter called this creative destruction. That technology applied to the economy and industry does not just create, it destroys as well. It creates enormous wealth, but it destroys occupations, industries, entire communities' ways of life. And with technology doubling every generation since 1870, we have this Schumpeterian process overturning everything and overturning everything again, in the following generation. So one way to think of that is the running sociological society code on top of the forces of production hardware of the human economy, and polity, sociology, and society and culture too, has to be rewritten on the fly to adapt to the fact that we're now doing different things in a different way. And the other thing is that a market economy works by giving social power on the basis of your ownership of things. That in a market society, the only form of social power comes from the only rights that are respected, and the only rights that are respected are property rights. And hence you have to be willing to accept a society in which the only rights that matter are property rights. And the only people whose voices really matter in determining what's being done, are the owners of valuable property, if the market economy is going to do its job. And Karl Polanyi points out that this is a stark utopia, and it is unsustainable to any human society, because people will insist that they have rights other than property rights, that even if they don't own valuable property, they deserve some kind of voice. That people want a neighborhood and a community that they recognize and think they have a right to that. I was just reading about how both of the Democratic candidates in the New York City, they say New York is, quote, overbuilt, unquote, in spite of the fact that land values would suggest that there are huge numbers of people who want to move there now and could be productive there who aren't. People think that they deserve an income commensurate with who they are and how hard they worked. People think that they deserve some kind of stability in their lives, that they shouldn't be unable to continue to practice their profession just because it has failed some maximum profitability test set by a rootless cosmopolite 5,000 away. And people also think very strongly that other people should get what they deserve as well, both in good and in bad ways. That society shouldn't have either grifters or slackers who live lives better than they are accustomed to, that they ought to. And those societal demands for something that the market economy doesn't produce, those demands for social justice, whatever a society thinks social justice is at any point in time, that those are going to upend any attempt to establish the von Hayekian Cadillactic market utopia in which we're all focused on the crowdsourcing mechanism that is the market economy, and we accept that distribution just falls out as a chance outcome of increased productivity.
I think this raises a question, because this is essentially a dynamic between economic growth and stability and social insurance. And you can kind of...
You can say it's social insurance, but remember that social democracy, which was all about social insurance, failed its sustainability test in the 1970s, right? And led to our current era of, quote, neoliberalism, unquote.
Well, that's kind of what I wanted to ask about was, do you think that this is a real trade-off, or is this kind of a fake trade-off that you don't actually have to choose between growth and social insurance, or do you actually have to choose one of Hayek or Polanyi, or can you have both at the same time, I guess?
Von Hayek would have said and did say that you dare not ask for social insurance, right? You dare not ask for social justice of any form. You recognize that the market economy is productive and it will make us rich, and that's all it can do. And if you ask for anything more, you then put yourself on the road to serfdom. Right? That the only gospel that you should follow is the market giveth, the market taketh away, blessed be the name of the market. And that's where you should sit. Now, post-World War II social democracy in the global north. You have John Maynard Keynes saying, let's focus on full employment so everyone has a job and labor has at least some bargaining power. And, Keynesian full employment policies conducted by my technocratic students have the added benefit that they produce a low interest rate environment. And if interest rates and profit rates are very low, well, then plutocracy ceases to be a problem, because the only way plutocrats can exercise their social power is by spending down their capital, and then they cease to be plutocrats. And so income and wealth inequality cease to be a first-order problem, become a second-order problem as well, if you simply let Keynes's technocratic students run things. Add to this the proper amount of Pigouvian compensation for externalities, And then on top of that, add a Beveragian, strongly progressive inheritance and income and wealth taxes on the one hand, and a universal basic income support on the bottom, plus take a whole bunch of things, schools, pools, parks, and so forth, out of the market as a whole and have them publicly provided. And you can get a situation or a society in which, yes, there's still creative destruction going on, but being destroyed is not all that bad, because you can find another job because it's full employment, and even if it's not the job you think you deserve at the salary you think you deserve, still you're twice as rich as your parents were, plus there's all this income support and all these public amenities. And that was the post-World War II mixed economy social democratic solution to the dilemma between Hayek and Polanyi, and there were people who thought it was sustainable. But lo and behold, in the late 1970s, we get the election of Thatcher and Reagan, and then the cementing of their ideas into power, and we seem to be back with the dilemma again.
It seems like a feature of history that, you solve one set of problems and then, you pat yourself on the back, and then an entirely new set of problems comes up and smacks you in the face a little bit.
You shouldn't be surprised, right, that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, right, Charlie from Trier and Freddie from Barman, they made a big deal out of the fact that the forces of production in 1870 in the steam power age were qualitatively different from those of 1000 in the feudal age, and so you needed an entirely different social system on top of them. You needed a very different set of running sociological societal code cobbled together in the bourgeois epoch than you'd had in the feudal epoch. But then we have the same amount of change from 1000 to 1870. We have that same amount of change from 1870 to 1920 as we move into the second industrial revolution economy from the steam power economy. And then the same proportional change from 1920 to 1970 as we move from the second industrial revolution economy into what the French call the Fordist economy. And then the same amount of change from 1970 to 2020 as we're now in a global value chain information age economy. And at each time, there's no reason to think that the sociological, political, and indeed economic systems running on top of the forces of production that worked 50 years ago are going to work today. Indeed, it would be remarkable if they did. And so we once again have to try to rejigger institutions together on the fly. In the 1970s, it was the inflation of that decade that very much focused people's minds on the idea that social democracy had gotten over-bureaucratized.
So this is what I wanted to ask you about, actually. I wanted to ask you about this very thing, because your frame in the book is essentially, and this is, again, I'm oversimplifying. Everyone go buy the book if you want the not simple version. But your frame in the book is roughly that, the global North embraced social democracy post-World War II until about 1970 or 1973 or such. And then after that, there was a neoliberal turn. And I have a couple questions about this, but first, I think I'll just ask, what were the perceived problems with social democracy, and why did people take issue with the current system in that era? And were those criticisms legitimate, illegitimate?
At the surface level, there was the inflation of the 1970s, which was read as being that social democratic governments had handed out too many tickets to what was being produced, more tickets to what was being produced than was in fact being produced, and that the economy needed to rebalance itself by having people in occupations that were unproductive be powerfully incentivized to find others, that in some sense a recession was needed to deal with this fact that there were too many tickets and get demand back into sync with potential supply. But that was simply a surface manifestation of the fact that you had a big productivity slowdown, that social democracy had in some sense been eating the seed corn established during previous eras, and the engine of economic growth was no longer hitting on its proper number of cylinders. Plus, you had a great many parts of the social democratic, say, institutional setup were thought to have very damaging consequences for incentives and work effort. Plus, there was the view that a group that had a strong political voice could get itself an entrenched set of rights that we were turning into a rent-seeking society. Plus, there was a general decline in moral values and in a willingness to work hard and actually be a contributing member of society. And the neoliberal turn, debureaucratize, and give more of a role to the market economy in terms of incentivizing success and also punishing failure, was thought to be a relatively needed reform. That even British Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm, a guy who to the end of his life, if you got him going, would say that the collectivization of agriculture in the 1930s was worth trying because it might, after all, have been the road to a real utopia. Even Eric Hobsbawm would talk about how the good ship social democracy needed to have its rent-seeking barnacles cleansed off by a proper Thatcherite scrub. And Eric Hobsbawm as Thatcherite, as approver of Margaret Thatcher's attempts to break British unions, for as Hobsbawm said, there turned out their social power was not how unionized workers could amplify production, but rather how unionized workers' strikes could inconvenience the public. That's a strong sign, I think, of how many few friends social democracy had in the late 1970s. The interesting thing is that with the coming of Reagan and Thatcher, we did not get a restoration of post-World War II economic growth rates. That kind of incentivizing economic growth did not seem to work. We did not get a moral regeneration of society. We did not get the kind of thing that David Stockman hoped for, that we would cut the size of the government by eliminating weak claims on public money. While thus allowing more of the money to go to genuinely weak claimants who also needed support. That basically we got very little out of it, except for a much higher degree of income and wealth inequality. There I would kind of split the world into left neoliberals and right neoliberals, with right neoliberals saying that income inequality is a pretty good thing because people shouldn't get incomes disproportionate to their moral worth. And the market's not a perfect, but a pretty good judge to your moral worth in some sense. And left neoliberals saying, yes, there were large elements of truth in the over-bureaucratized and rent-seeking society critiques. But, and yes, it is often the case that market mechanisms are the right means to social democratic ends, that market crowdsourcing with proper incentives rather than bureaucracy is the best way to do a huge bunch of things. But Jesus, let's not go overboard. Let's realize that what we're really trying to do is run a con game by having another generation of social democracy, although under neoliberal sheep's clothing. That when Gene Sperling would talk about how the Clinton administration was focused on working families, and how we're in the business of helping working families and not those slackers out there. There always was an asterisk there about how people thought to be slackers really aren't, and if only you give them proper support, in terms of building their skills and putting them in the right sociological environment and giving them the right life coaches. Everyone would like to be a hardworking American. And I think where we're in some sense stuck, because we think we would like to have institutions that produce faster growth and a fairer and more equal distribution, but we've been unable to figure out how to write them on the fly.
It's interesting to me because a lot of the other shifts that we talk about in this book are very world-shaking, paradigm-shifting kind of things where you talk about, and we're not going to even have time to get into it, but the rise of fascism, the rise of socialism, the New Deal completely shifting from, government spending was something around 5% of the economy to afterwards it was almost an order of magnitude higher. But when I look at the social democracy to neoliberalism shift, there's something there, obviously. Reagan and Thatcher were part of a moment, and Bill Clinton extended it a little bit. And, you can talk about Jimmy Carter's deregulatory impulses, deregulating the airlines and the craft brew industry, which I love. But there's something there. But at the same time, it doesn't seem like a world-shaking kind of thing because, government spending as a percentage of GDP didn't really shift very much as a result of this era. It actually increased a little bit, and healthcare spending continued to rise, and Social Security spending as part of the demographic wave of boomers, Social Security spending continues to rise. And so in some sense, this was a very like a marginal kind of I don't want to say marginal revolution because but it was a marginal change rather than a kind of a really earthquake change.
No, it's a
At least it seems that
change.
way.
It's a marginal change in the operation of the post-World War II state. It's a substantial change in how people understand, what the state is doing. And it's a really substantial change in terms of, what the social world looks like. George Romney, right? George Romney, president of American Motors, the fourth auto company, and auto industry lobbyist and governor of Michigan, and then health, education, and welfare secretary, right? George Romney lives in a relatively ritzy suburb of Detroit, but, he has a normal suburban house with perhaps twice the standard Ann Arbor footprint of the time. Maybe 2 or 3 more rooms, and the rooms are bigger. And he probably owns a cottage on the Upper Peninsula of Michigan to go to in the summers where it's warm enough. He doesn't even get to drive a fancy car because he has to drive a Nash Rambler, given that was American Motors' thing. But he is at the top of the American economic sociological pyramid in the 1960s. Mitt Romney has 8 houses, right? Is his son. And Mitt Romney gets nuked from the 2008 Republican ticket because McCain and Romney together would have owned more than 20 houses. That seems to be a difference that in some sense makes a difference in the sense that a lot of people are very upset one way or the other that they do not see the world as having a middle-class society, do not see the United States as being still a middle-class society of one sort or another. And, attempts to say, well, the United States is really weird, right? That when Otto von Bismarck pushes through universal health insurance for Germans in the 1880s, and when people denounce him as socialisms, he is willing to stand up there in the Reichstag and says it's a good kind of socialism. That you market liberals think the only sources of social power should indeed be property rights, but I'm a German aristocrat, and I recognize that there are all sorts of ties of dependence and obligation running all around the place that are independent of whether we have property. And since the people are loyal to the emperor needs to be loyal to the people, and spending some of the emperor's money on not having people die in the street of illness is a good thing to do. The form of the United States' social insurance state is quite weird, and I would not say that I completely understand it. As my friend Ying-Yi Qian said, the difference between the era of social democracy and neoliberalism is vastly bigger in the global south than in the global north. And also that neoliberalism has been vastly more successful in the global south than in the global north.
Well, let's actually talk about that, because we don't have a ton of time left, and there's 100 other questions I could ask you, but unfortunately I'm only going to get to ask a couple more. But I wanted to ask about the global south and kind of the developing world, I guess as we call it now, one of the big stories of the last 100 years has been not just inequality, and its ups and downs. Inequality decreased and then increased within the rich world, but the inequality between very rich countries and very poor countries. What would you say? I mean, why was catch-up growth so slow and so poor in many places throughout the world for so long? Like, if we're looking at most of the 20th century, there was a lot of it where the poor countries were actually getting poorer and not catching up.
Right. Well, a lot of it was empire, right? The colonizers, they're unwilling to spend money on and unwilling to adopt for their colonies the kind of Hamiltonian economic development policies that it turns out are the best and the easiest way to which you can march over into the developed countries, take a look around, decide that you want to start your industrialization path by becoming an exporter of labor-intensive manufactures, and using that to build your society's knowledge base and engineering expertise and communities, and then march up, possibly aided by an export sector in the particular commodities that you're best at producing, possibly not. You need to do that. Practically anyone can do that. Japan starts doing that in 1870 with enormous success. A colonial government's not interested in doing that. And indeed, many countries are best thought of as internally colonized. Latin America as internally colonized by its own notionally Castilian-descended elite. Imperial China internally colonized by the Manchu dynasty and its associated clans. Until you kind of get rid of that, you really don't have a chance for rapid catch-up. After the end of the colonial era, you then have a very disappointing generation and a half on the one hand, pretty much in most of the developing countries. And you also have the extraordinary thing of extraordinary sub-Saharan African retardation for 2 generations. I wouldn't say I really understand either of those terribly well. The consensus or the near consensus among economic historians for Africans, it has something to do with the sheer scale of imperial commercial era slavery and the resulting continent-wide destruction of social trust, which does not have huge bad effects when you can borrow your colonizers' network of social trust and mercantile exchange and economic activity. But, once the colonizers have gone and once their infrastructure is gone, all of a sudden there's no belief that any business partner outside of your own narrow ethnic group can be trusted, and not all of them.
The institutions that they set up were essentially extractive institutions meant to just get money out, and once they left, they didn't leave them with a bunch of great inclusive institutions.
Although their formal form looks a lot like developmental institutions, but I have that bone to pick with Daron and company later on. But indeed, the second point, I think the extractive point is right. Because suppose you're building a government from zero, it has to have supporters, which means people have to have a reason to support it, which means either it has to be very, very, very good at making you productive, better than alternative government, or it has to figure a way to take wealth from its non-supporters and give them to its supporters. And that kind of logic of let me create a base of supporters that, benefits from my rule and will support me is very much antithetical to the logic of let's respect property rights so people have incentives to accumulate, reinvest, and build capital. And indeed, you find this, Andre Schleifer and I will claim you find this in Europe since 1000. That wherever there are kings interested in building states, economic growth dies. That only where the government is run as a kind of coalition of merchants each of which is much more interested in having their own life proceed as normal, rather than in building up a state of which they are going to be the head. That European countries managed to successfully urbanize and grow.
You could even argue that, there's a thread there where if England doesn't successfully kind of wrest power, away from the king and give it to Parliament, if that doesn't happen, does the Industrial Revolution ever take off in England? It's an open question, but yeah.
It would seem unlikely, right? That, you need to have, which is very odd, because on the one hand, if you're going to have high real wages in the short run, you need to have a powerful state that can conquer the Atlantic. And on the other hand, that powerful state, that the British night watchman state of the 19th century is in some ways the most extraordinarily peculiar of things, because it's not a weak state at all, right? That a weak state is Somalia, in which you have only what you and your guards can hold on to. The British 19th century state has to assign property rights to everything, and then it has to be strong enough to protect those property rights, from roving bandits, from local notables, from its own functionaries, and from its own hierarchical leaders as well. And something that's strong enough to do the first two, and yet also constrained enough to do the last two, is an extremely unusual and weird thing to developing in history. Much more real is, Henry VIII. If you have a nice source of property, Henry might decide he wants it and might send, Cromwell to find some legal excuse by which he can make it his.
So I want to share a story in the time we have left from the book. The book is titled Slouching Towards Utopia. There's an anecdote you share early in the book where someone in the late 1800s is imagining what the world of 2000 might look like. And they talk about how there's probably going to be this extraordinary thing where you can have music in your own home. The way that this author envisioned it was that you could call on the telephone and you would call in to a live orchestra, and it would be able to be played through the telephone into your home, and you might even be able to choose from 4 different orchestras. And this was said with such a tone of awe and wonder, and the author basically makes the argument, if you could live in such a place where at any time you liked, you could have your choice of 4 different orchestras to listen to, that would be utopia. Thinking about what that person says utopia is, and thinking about the actual level of technology we have today, do we live in utopia or not? Have we successfully slouched our way to utopia?
I think the view is, the expression is that we would have surpassed the limit of human felicity. If only we had say, a 1% of an iPod, of an old iPod. And indeed something that, well, look, actually being able to hear pretty good music at any one point in time is something that people valued a great deal. They would spend fortunes to go to concert halls, after all, right? I would say that, we certainly have much more than enough wealth worldwide to live in a utopia. And I would say that my life, at least, does seem pretty utopian to me. But, there's the problem of baking a sufficiently large economic pie for everyone to have enough. And then there's the problem of slicing it, of distributing it equitably so that the enough actually flows down. And then there's the problem of tasting it, of utilizing the pie, utilizing our wealth in order that we all live lives that leave us, safe, secure, healthy, and happy. I manifestly look around and I see that while we certainly are solving, and increasingly with every day, are solving the problem of baking a sufficiently large economic pie, the problems of slicing and tasting it, continue to flummox us. And this is weird because back before 1870, most people thought that most of the problems of society arose either because of general poverty, or because since there wasn't enough, governance was inevitably how does the elite run its force and fraud, exploitation and extraction machine on the rest of society, and how does it elbow other potential competitors for membership in the elite out of the way. And those were all supposed to fall away, by now. John Maynard Keynes in 1930 indeed did write that by our day, at least in the North Atlantic, humanity would no longer think that it faced an economic problem. Vladimir Lenin thought that by this time all workers would certainly be equal, because, yes, there would be necessary administrative coordination jobs, but people could rotate through them, because all that was required in order to do them would be the ability to add, subtract, multiply, divide, write things down, and issue appropriate receipts. Instead, the problems of slicing and tasting, of distributing and then properly utilizing our wealth really do seem to flummox us pretty completely, given how unhappy a civilization we seem to be. Like take, for example, this week's kerfuffle, right, over the student debt kind of cancellation initiative, right? He said he'd do it during the campaign. Biden did. There is an argument that a bunch of people have been encouraged to go to college and then handed a very lousy job market for the following 15 years, which hasn't paid off. And then they've been caught in this kind of, you miss a payment, the fees and the interest compound at a ridiculous rate, given that we've constructed a financial system that in general is very good at extracting fees and penalties from people who are not careful to make all their payments on time. And it's only a maximum of $10,000. If I were spending $35 billion a year, I would not spend it on that. I would spend it on something that had a much bigger redistributional bang. But it's not something that the Economist that you should denounce as, or the Economist has denounced it as, the Inflation Acceleration Act. It's not something that should be pushed out into the world as, Biden's initiative to kind of enrich the slacker baristas of Manhattan and Brooklyn and to give a free ride to people who majored in lesbian dance therapy. It's a totally disproportionate response to the feeling that somehow we have a desperate economic problem still. And the most urgent and desperate thing is that some people who are not in our in-group are somehow managing to benefit from it. I look at this and I think that this is a society where enormous absolute wealth has kind of failed to create a place where people have a sense of proportion, and indeed of sanity.
One thing I'm curious about is, a lot of people think that we're on the cusp of some sort of new political era. And this could be because you're a member of the right, which is now more populist and authoritarian leaning in the Western world. And you see this with Donald Trump, certainly, but you also see, strains of this in France with Marine Le Pen. You see it in the UK. You see it in kind of the pseudo dictators like Orban and Bolsonaro, and it's in Turkey and the Philippines and a lot of places. Or you could even look at, people on the center left and left say that there's a resurgent left and a resurgent form of social democracy or even democratic socialism. And some people think that's the future. And so people think there may be a paradigm shift coming. And I don't want to ask you to predict, what the next 60 years are going to look like, because nobody can do that. But I'll just ask, what's one thing that you're optimistic about for the future, for the next several decades? And what's one thing that you're worried about?
Well, simply that in a generation we will have much better technologies that will enable us to do absolutely wonderful things. The problem is that I think the best ways of building running code, running sociological code on top of the changing forces of production. I kind of thought the post-World War II von Hayek married to Polanyi, blessed by John Maynard Keynes, was a very good shot, and ought to have been good enough, but, people are certainly unhappy. And the other alternatives seem to be some form of, I don't really want to call it von Hayek, because Trump and Trumpists are not kind of market economy people at all. Should I say, Friedrich List's mercantilism married to Mussolini, blessed by Carl Schmitt.
It wouldn't be the worst description, yeah.
Or von Hayek married to Lenin, blessed by Master Kung. That, if those are our two combinations, the two likely successors, we may well look back on the troubled and uncertain neoliberal age as, at one that at least did not botch things up completely. And if we look back at the history since 1870, we find a lot of places where we have managed to use our technological powers, to botch them up pretty completely.
All right, so it's time for the final question that we always ask on this podcast, and that is, where should people go if they want to learn more? And I'll start out here by saying, obviously, they should buy the book. The book is Slouching Towards Utopia. It's out on September 6th. It's a great read. It has way more detail than this podcast can have. But other than the book itself, is there anything that you would recommend for people who are interested in what we're talking about today?
Well, I would say I would actually recommend two other books also coming out this fall. The first is Gary Gerstl's The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order, which is his attempt at a deep dive into kind of why social democracy, as he understood it, failed its 1970s sustainability test, and how neoliberalism, both left and right versions, hope to replace it, and how they in turn have managed to run aground, and how its energy has ebbed. I do not agree with all of it, or indeed with more than 2/3 of it, but he's wrestling very hard with the problems, and it's very well worth reading. And the other is Will MacAskill's What We Owe the Future, which has the virtue, which my book does not, of being short, and which has the virtue or the vice, I think, of really being 6 different 50-page essays, each of which should be a book on its own, more or less stapled together, because he jumps from topic to topic in the long-termism / effective altruism space. But it's a wonderful read. And if you're interested in the future of humanity, I think you have to read it this fall.
Well, I think those are great recommendations, and I just want to say I really enjoyed the book, and I've really enjoyed having you on the podcast, Brad. I've been trying to grab you for a long time. Everyone, I want to say one final time that my guest today has been Brad DeLong, the book Slouching Towards Utopia. Brad, thank you so much for coming on today.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for inviting me.